On February 19, 1942, the Canadian city of Winnipeg, Manitoba fell under German occupation. Or at least this is what the organizers of IF Day, the simulated Nazi invasion of Winnipeg, wanted Winnipeggers to believe. This elaborate military exercise, involving 3,500 members of the Canadian Army and Royal Canadian Air Force, was organized by the Greater Winnipeg Victory Loan organization in an attempt to sell war bonds, and would become a shining example of the efforts undertaken on the home front to aid the war effort overseas. Canada joined the Second World War on the 10th of September 1939. Being a small country with a population of just over 11 million, Canada would need to mobilize a significant amount of its resources to be able to contribute to the war effort. This would require a significant amount of money that the government did not have. The Canadian government began selling war bonds, known as victory bonds, during the First World War to finance its participation in that conflict. To finance the Second World War, the government began selling war savings certificates in addition to victory bonds. These war savings certificates matured after a holding period of 7 years and paid $5 for every $4 invested. Individuals were not allowed to own more than $600 worth of these certificates. This would provide the government with $318 million over the course of the war, but this was only a fraction of the large sum required to fight an overseas campaign. It was victory bonds that would provide the Canadian government with a far more significant sum of money, with a goal set at $600 million. Throughout the duration of the war, there would be 10 bond drives, and an additional bond drive after the war had concluded. The first of these drives, in February 1940, was wildly successful, meeting its goal of $20 million in less than 48 hours. The second drive, in September of 1940, would reach its goal of $30 million in nearly the same amount of time. As the war dragged on through 1941, however, the government realized that a national strategy would be required, and the National War Finance Committee was founded. Bond drives were to take place every 6 months, and they would continue to be successful. However, as more and more Canadians purchased victory bonds, the government needed to resort to more creative methods to encourage people to invest the money they had left. This included spending more than $3 million on marketing campaigns and financing IF Day in Winnipeg. The first victory bond drive of 1942 ran from February 16th to March 9th. The Canadian government assigned the province of Manitoba and its capital city Winnipeg lofty fundraising goals. For Manitoba, the goal was to raise $45 million, with more than $24 million to come from Winnipeg alone. This would require some creative thinking on the part of local businessman and chairman of the Greater Winnipeg Victory Loan Committee, John Draper Perrin. Their solution was IF Day, a simulated Nazi invasion of Manitoba that was intended to bring the war closer to home for a province in central Canada that was about as far from the war as anyone in the world at the time. Manitoba would be divided into 45 sections, each of which would represent a $1 million portion of the fundraising target. As this money was raised, these sections were reclaimed from the Germans, and Manitoba was liberated, piece by piece. The simulation would require an extensive military contingent from the Canadian Army and Royal Canadian Air Force. 3,500 soldiers from various army units would participate, making IF Day the largest military exercise in Winnipeg history to that point. The Nazi troops came from the Young Men's Board of Trade and were to be commanded by Erich von Nuremberg. The defending forces were to be commanded by Colonel D.S. McKay. The events were highly publicized in the newspapers before they were to take place throughout Manitoba to make it clear that this was only a simulation. Warnings were even given to residents of Minnesota, as they would be able to hear the broadcasts coming out of Manitoba on the day of the invasion. The simulation began on February 18th, with the Royal Canadian Air Force flying planes over Winnipeg painted like German aircraft. In the small town of Selkirk, Manitoba, a 1-hour blackout was held, complemented by a simulated bombing. These air raids would set the stage for the following day's events. On February 19th at 5:30 a.m., a radio station was taken over for the purposes of the day's information broadcasts, and by 5:45 the Nazi troops had begun to assemble. Defense forces were called into action at the Fort Osborne Barracks and the Minto and McGregor armories at 6:30, and an air raid and blackout were simulated at 7 a.m. This was the cue for the Nazis to begin their attack, defended by a contingent from the regular and reserve forces. A perimeter was established 5 kilometers from City Hall and would collapse to 3 kilometers by 7:45. In the course of the retreat of the defense forces, bridge demolitions were simulated through the use of coal and dynamite. Rubble was used to block the bridges, and fake casualties were sustained. Casualty stations were set up at strategic positions throughout the city to tend to the simulated casualties. Tanks were positioned at road and rail junctions, and anti-air vehicles and gunners fired blanks at the aircraft overhead. Despite the simulated defense, the city was overrun by 9:30 a.m., and Erich von Nuremberg was installed as the Gauleiter, or provincial leader. Some people were placed in an internment camp at Lower Fort Garry, including the Premier of Manitoba, several cabinet ministers, the Mayor of Winnipeg, the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba, and the Norwegian ambassador to the United States, who was visiting Winnipeg at the time. The stated objective of the Nazi invaders was to take advantage of Canada's low population density by colonizing the country. Several proclamations and commands were imposed by the Nazi government, announcing Nazi supremacy and new civil rules, including notices like this one. Ankündigung. It is hereby proclaimed that this territory is now a part of the Greater Reich and under the jurisdiction of Colonel Erich von Nuremberg, Gauleiter of the Führer. No civilians will be permitted on the streets between 9:30 p.m. and daybreak. All public places are out of bounds to civilians, and not more than 8 persons can gather at one time in any place. Every householder must provide billeting for 5 soldiers. All organizations of a military, semi-military, or fraternal nature are hereby disbanded and banned. Girl Guide, Boy Scout, and similar youth organizations will remain in existence but under the direction of the Gauleiter and stormtroops. All owners of motorcars, trucks, and buses must register them at occupation headquarters where they will be taken over by the Army of Occupation. Each farmer must immediately report all stocks of grain and livestock, and no farm produce may be sold except through the office of the Commandant of Supplies in Winnipeg. He may not keep any for his own consumption, but must buy it back through the central authority in Winnipeg. All national emblems, excluding the swastika, must immediately be destroyed. Each inhabitant will be furnished with a ration card, and food and clothing may only be purchased on presentation of this card. The following offenses will result in death without trial: attempting to organize resistance against the Army of Occupation, entering or leaving the province without permission, failure to report all goods possessed when ordered to do so, or possession of firearms. No one will act, speak, or think contrary to our decrees, published and ordered by the authority of Erich von Nuremberg. Several other events took place to add to the realism of the event. The Nazis posted notices on churches banning worship services and arrested any priests who objected. Buses were searched by armed guards. The local newspaper, the Winnipeg Tribune, was renamed Das Winnipeger Lügenblatt, which means the Winnipeg Lies Sheet, and was heavily censored and mostly in German. A book burning was held using the books the library had slated for disposal. Special school lessons were prepared, and one principal was arrested. Some stores were looted. The Canadian dollar was replaced with fake German Reichsmarks. All of the detail work that went into the event contributed to its success, and ensured that IF Day would not soon be forgotten. IF Day ended at 5:30 p.m. with a release of prisoners, a parade, and speeches. The Norwegian ambassador suggested that the simulation was an authentic glimpse of German behavior in German-ridden Europe. In Winnipeg alone, $3.2 million worth of victory bonds were sold on IF Day, the city's largest single-day total. Winnipeg surpassed its $24 million goal on February 24th, and the province as a whole raised $60 million, $15 million more than their quota. The campaign was wildly successful and received coverage throughout the world. Imitations were staged in several other communities, including a smaller-scale invasion in Vancouver that used some of the material from Winnipeg's IF Day. IF Day was a creative way for Winnipeg to sell victory bonds, and the Nazis never did invade Canada. The war was fought and won at sea and in Europe. Still, it is important to remember the contributions of the Canadians back at home who suffered through rations, the loss of family overseas, and who helped the Canadian government finance the war effort through the purchasing of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of war bonds. If you liked this video, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to this channel for more like it. Thanks for watching.